the GLOBSEC Brussels office, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar on EU-US dialogue in the post-corona world, organized by GLOBSEC in cooperation with the Atlantic Council. The webinar is part of a larger series that we named Europe in a New Decade, that we initiated here in Brussels at the newly established Brussels office, with the aim of discussing the most critical challenges of European Union moving forward. And now, in light of the corona pandemic, things are dramatically changed. This conversation also could not be more timely in the context of a rather deteriorating transatlantic relationship. So before I hand over to our moderator, I want to let you know that we are live streaming this session on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We also live tweeted under the hashtag GLOBSECGoesDigital. And for those who are already on Zoom, you can send your questions via the Q&A feature. For those on social media, we will be following the threads. And now I would like to introduce Ben Haddad, Director of Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council, to introduce this terrific panel and to kickstart the conversation. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. And it's terrific to be with you today, this morning here in Washington, the United States, for this another event in partnership between the Atlantic Council and GLOBSEC on US-EU relations facing COVID-19. I'm joined by a great panel today. I have Dr. Kinga Brzezinska, the head of the Future of Europe program at GLOBSEC, speaking from Bratislava. Mathurey Sitharaman, the founder of Facultas Media, speaking from London. Nikolai Stefanuta, who is a member of the European Parliament, the vice chair of the delegation for the relations with the United States in Brussels, and Dr. Tori Taussig, research director for Europe and Transatlantic Relations at the Belfer Center at Harvard. Dr. Brzezinska, let me start with you, speaking from Europe, to give us what you think is the lessons to be learned on the transatlantic front from this crisis. We've seen actually Europe and the United States so far have been very hard hit, especially Western Europe. This should be a moment for calls for transatlantic cooperation, both for dealing with the health impact of a pandemic, dealing with the economic crisis, but it seems on the contrary that we've seen inward-looking reactions, both from the United States, but also the European Union. Is that your assessment?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben, and good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Yeah, I think it's just. Maybe let me start with the general outlook and how I think by now we are all COVID-19 experts, even without being worked on health issues in our whole professional career. We have to examine everything that we see now through the lenses of the COVID-19. But so there are, I think your assessment was right. It's the time, and I little bit see it also in a way how the EU reacted to the crisis and the response, and lack of coordinated response among the member states. I think this crisis came and hit us so unexpectedly that we didn't know how exactly in member states how to talk to each other, how to we should have coordinated the closure of the border. So adding this to this picture, also US, it makes it even more complicated. Also, the first signals from the US administration of banning Schengen and member states to citizens of the Schengen zone to travel to the US without coordination, it kind of started all in a bad way. But as of now, 2 months after, the voices of the experts are still divided. Some of them, they say that the COVID-19 will have a long-lasting impact, both on the world in general, but also on the transatlantic relations. There are others, they say that, you know, it will bring some changes, but we should not expect any new order being made. So I would, from what also I read now, COVID-19 so far has done little to make transatlantic relation worse. We have seen that the transatlantic relation was kind of full of mistrust or discord recently. However, both regions dealing with tackling the crisis 19 might pay less attention to building relation per se, which might not be a bad thing. I would say, and finish with that, that there are three possible scenarios right now that have been drafted or have been, people were brainstorming about them, where the transatlantic relation might go. First is that because EU is uncertain about the US role in the world and also in transatlantic relations, EU becomes more assertive and play a more independent role in the global stage. Second is the decline of the US-EU relation, which push Europe to deal more independently with China or Russia. So it's see and look, but rather EU is trying to find a middle way to talk to great powers. The last one is that the transatlantic partnership actually endures, and the EU member states, they keep applying the strategic patience that have been applied now and look for cooperation in political, economic, and security dimension wherever it's possible. So the time will probably show which scenario will be we will live through. But I will maybe leave it for further discussion among the speakers as well, which one we think will be the worst, best, or more probable and less probable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up on these scenarios because, you know, one of the interesting aspects of this conversation is that it's focused on US-EU, and obviously it's not US-Europe or the transatlantic relationship writ large. It is the relationship with the European Union that has particularly suffered, I think, these last few years as the administration has focused more on bilateral relations with specific member states. And I want to turn to Dr. Taussig in the United States. You've done a lot of work on this issue. Do you expect maybe a shift? You know, we're in an electoral year in the United States. Do you think we could see a different kind of tone towards the EU, towards Brussels? And would you support that?
Thank you, Ben. I agree with you that over these last couple of years, we've seen a fissure from Washington in its support, not just for the EU, but for the European project and for European integration. Many transatlanticists, both in the US and Europe, see President Trump as the first modern American president to not only kind of condemn European integration, but be hostily, have a hostile approach toward it. Whether we've seen that in the trade wars or defense spending, or as you mentioned, prioritizing bilateral ties, prioritizing ties with extreme right or populist governments over the European Union. Lamentably, as we look at the US position toward Europe during this crisis, not much has changed. And in fact, it has accelerated trends toward disintegration, negative aspects of the transatlantic relationship. I think, as you mentioned, it is also an election year. We have to look, you know, as Americans in the COVID crisis, but also beyond to November, and what type of projects we could work on together with the European Union. But the crisis has put us in a position where we're seeing, as Kinga mentioned before, more nationalist, inward-looking approaches that I worry will inhibit greater cooperation between the US and the EU moving forward. But, and I hate to start on a political note, but it will depend more who is in the Oval Office, I think, than how this crisis plays out.
Let me turn to Brussels. Nicolai Stefanuta, you're in the European Parliament. You've heard Kinga mention the possibility of the European Union, one scenario in which the European Union becomes sort of a hedge between the United States and China. We have seen actually increased tensions, I would say, between the EU and China. Joseph Borrell, the High Representative, recently saying that Europeans had been naive towards China. Do you think there's going to be a geopolitical inflection coming out of this crisis?
I don't have to think it to know it. This has not just been a crisis for health. I think everybody can agree to that. This has been a health crisis, an economic crisis, a strategic geopolitical crisis. And I have 5 points that I wanted to make to you today. The crisis has been a big wake-up call, and if I may call it maybe a useful dress rehearsal, because we were expecting some sort of major, perhaps climatic event or geostrategic event, yet we had a pandemic crisis. And I do believe, in spite of the ruthlessness this might perhaps bring to mind, this is a useful exercise in knowing what can happen when things go rough. And I'm thinking that the crisis interrupted, for instance, the Operation Defender Europe, that brought 30,000 US troops and other NATO troops to Europe to deploy and to check how fast they can move around the continent. Because if push comes to shove on this continent, it is not that easy to move around troops and equipment. We don't have a Schengen for military equipment. So you can imagine that if during a pandemic borders closed so fast, what would the scenario be during war? And I hate to bring up this word, but I do believe that the crisis also showed us that everything's connected. Climate, health, economics, security problems are interconnected. So I do believe perhaps one other element that we can take from this crisis is that we need to revise our national security strategies to think in these terms. It's no longer a tank, it can be a virus, it can be disinformation, it can be something else that might be much more harmful than direct physical attack. So I do believe that perhaps we can learn from this and we can improve for when another element comes to mind like that. We in the European Union are speaking more and more of low probability, high impact events. So I think you in the US call them black swans. I mean, you're always better with terms. You make it simple. People understand black swan. We call it high probability, low probability, high impact. So we're learning. But I do believe we have to take more and more these type of events in mind and figure out a strategy for these kind of unlikely but very, very, very important events, because when they happen, the citizen demands answers. And if they don't see them, they lose credibility in the entire project. Thirdly, we also saw that the US and the EU must remain partners and that nobody can fight climate change on their own, no matter how big you are. I'm sorry to say it. I say it also to member states here in the EU. I say it to Germany. I say it to Sweden. No matter how big and rich you are, you cannot face this on your own. And summer is coming, another dry summer, another hot summer. We might see climatic events. We might see forest fires and other types of things that might require, again, perhaps a common thinking. And this also is valid for the US relation. And why am I saying that? Because instead of having one transatlantic crisis, we had 27 in the EU and 50 in the US. Because states started competing against each other, both in the EU and the US, buying the same personal protection equipment, buying the same type of ventilators. I think that was a failure. I'm sorry to say it. There was a failure of the federal system to deal with it and to let states be out there on their own, and even worse, to compete against each other, therefore driving prices up globally. I thought the best way to do it would have been to work together. And I'm looking towards the future. I'm looking towards the vaccine and other types of things that will require our transatlantic cooperation, so that we don't descend into a beggar thy neighbor policy. Fourthly, we have, and I'm finishing with in a second, we have a historical partnership that was often compared to a marriage. Well, if this is a marriage, we are in the type of marriage where partners keep separate accounts and do their own investments. Each buys their own house or whatever without telling the other one. So that is, that is a marriage where trust has been a bit shaken. So we have to work on that. I do believe we are still the world's strongest partners on paper and in reality. However, we have to work a bit on our trust, and we have to to tell one another more what the strategy is, because you mentioned China, because you mentioned the other players who are all not just onlookers to this, but active players. And lastly, rules matter. We still have to work on human rights and democracy. We saw that authoritarian leaders across the world have no remorse in strangling democracy. They've done it quite openly in many places, using the extraordinary powers given by the crisis. And not in the least, we have sabotaged ourselves by sabotaging the international institutions that guaranteed the rules of the game, by sabotaging the WTO and now perhaps also the WHO and others. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's lots of points that I'd like us to come back to. You just talked about WTO, the future of trade, of the multilateral system. This obviously been one of the big transatlantic disagreements over the last few years. Let me turn to Mehthari Sitaraman in London. I want to ask you two questions, actually. We've been talking about the health crisis, the geopolitical crisis. I want to ask you also about the economic and business dimension of this. Obviously, both European economies, including in the countries that dealt well with the pandemic, and in the United States, are going to suffer a deep recession. And I want to ask you about the potential for cooperation for dealing with the long-term economic consequence of this crisis. But obviously, I have to ask you, we're having a US-EU conversation. You're based in London. We just talked about a marriage. There's a divorce going on right now. Actually, the divorce was already declared between the European Union and the UK. What role can the UK play in this respect between Europe and the United States?
Well, at this point, I would say first of all to that question, the last part of the question, Ben, right now, probably not much of a role. I think at this point, it's a relationship between Brussels and Washington, and that is going to be defined, like Tori said, by these elections and what happens with the recession and how that plays out till the ballots are cast and how that process happens within the United States. I think what we need to remember, and if you take a step back, is that none of what we're seeing, as has been said before by Tori and also by Kinga, is anything that's surprising. Not much has changed. We've seen the US-China trade relations impact the EU. We've been asking this question for a very long time as to how Germany will handle it, how the EU 27 would handle it, 28 before the divorce was finalized. And I think what you're seeing with COVID and with companies kind of trying to sit back and say, okay, we had a panic in January, February, when China shut everything down and the global supply chain went to hell, is the realization that perhaps within the system, we were relying too much on a Chinese manufacturing unit. We were relying too much on the US consumer and not really focusing back on the 27 countries that had the potential to tap into that 550 million consumer base that we have already in Europe. Where UK sits, it's pretty much around the same mistaken feeling that we could do with the consumer base sitting in the US. We could continue our relations with China. We could keep these bilaterals going. But in boardrooms across the FTSE 100 or the Fortune 500 or Fortune Global 500, I think everyone's really coming back to say, okay, we're looking at a post-COVID situation. We don't know who's going to be in power in the Oval Office by come November. It could be a Democrat, it could be a return of President Trump. What happens in that particular situation that we can control? And that's where you're seeing organizations like the B Team or companies that can be the pivots, can be the transitionary factor in defining policy, actually take the lead and say, okay, this is what we said we would do. We might have to accelerate the process as quickly as possible, change supply chains, and kind of redistribute how we look at it. So you're going to see a lot of people bringing their supply chains back towards more local markets. You're going to see a lot more lobbying from a lot of companies when it comes to climate change, because they're seeing their stakeholders start looking at COVID, as has been mentioned, as part of a larger picture of how you go forward in this economy. And you're going to also have a lot of unemployed people who are going to ask questions, tough questions of their governments. And those governments need employers to be on their side. So you're going to see businesses really responsible businesses that survive this crisis really take on a whole different character in terms of defining policies for governments and influencing. Till now, which has just been simple lobbying, you're going to see that influence increase dramatically. And technology is really only going to push that.
I want to follow up with you a little bit on this, because I find this fascinating. So do you think that businesses, without being regulated, pushed by the government, can make these decisions on their own? Because I wonder, to what extent, in the short term, clearly it will be a costly decision, and it will be sort of a decision that will impact their margins for sure. And I wonder to what extent you can't make the reverse reasoning, thinking, well, even the companies actually that were integrated within one country are going to be impacted by this, because all of our economies shut down, whether you're, all over the globe or just locally. So you see signs already of companies that are making this move to repatriate their supply chains from China?
I think if you look at where the supply, it's been happening since the US-China trade relations really started bottoming out. At the worst of it, people did start looking at how they could diversify those supply chains. And those supply chains start moving to, other countries like South Korea, to India, to some African countries, just because certain companies that have the scale, and again, we're talking about companies that have the scale to do this, who in the past may have only known their tier one suppliers and didn't know the supply chain beyond that, kind of realized, hang on a minute, during a pandemic, or in previous cases, natural disasters, whether they were earthquakes or a potential trade war escalation, had to diversify. So you saw companies start moving some of their production lines or some of their supply chains outside of a China, where they didn't know what would happen tomorrow if, say, the US-China relations completely crashed out. So you did see it, and now you're going to see an escalation of how many of them do that. Will they pull completely out of China? No, nobody's going to do that, but they're going to diversify for sure.
It's really interesting. Thanks. So we already have some questions, and please write down your questions in the Q&A box. I actually think the first question is very interesting, so I want to ask it right now. So because we're all talking about how this crisis is a game changer, nothing will ever be the same. But I actually want to ask our panelists, what if it's exactly the same and President Trump is reelected? And what do you expect from a second term? But more importantly, in our case, what does it mean for US-EU relations? I see that Tori Tosig has already unmuted herself, so I will turn to her to answer that question. But I want to ask, especially more concretely, what can be done? What could be a positive transatlantic agenda in a Trump second term?
Okay, I'll start. I was just getting ready. I wasn't jumping the queue. But I think, with this crisis, we've seen an acceleration of a lot of trends that were already there. And I think for, even before this crisis, Europeans were steeling themselves for what a second Trump administration could look like. And we've heard a number of our panelists talk about Europe strengthening its own foundations, becoming a more geopolitical, strategically autonomous actor on the world stage. And if we were to see a second Trump administration, and I'll just apply this to the kind of geopolitical triangle of the US, the EU, and China, I think what we'll see is a European Union and European countries more interested in hedging, not necessarily falling into China's arms, but hedging away from the transatlantic relationship. I mentioned that this has kind of been accelerated by the crisis because we already saw that happening. But let me just put forward a few very worrying polling numbers that a great China watcher, a great China EU watcher, Noah Barkin, put forward in an article yesterday that gets to this acceleration of the declining transatlantic relationship that we could see continued in a Trump administration. So there was a poll released in Germany this week, which showed that 36% of Germans view the United States as its most favorable partner on the world stage. 37% of those Germans also said China was the most favorable partner on the world stage. This is a significant decrease on behalf of the United States just in the last few months, which showed that the crisis has accelerated trends among Germans who've already viewed the United States negatively. Ben, we'll go to your home country of France. When French respondents were asked what country is best positioned to deal with future challenges of the next decade, only 3% said the United States was best positioned to deal with challenges of the coming decade. If we go to the UK, America's oldest and closest partnership, only 28% of Britons said that they trusted the United States to act responsibly on the world stage. None of these figures have anything to do with the EU-China relationship. This all has to do with the disintegrating transatlantic relationship that when we bring China into the picture, do make China look like a little bit more of a favorable, multilateral, dependable partner. And I'll just close by saying, I don't think that if there were a second Trump administration, as I mentioned before, we would see Europeans fall into China's arms. I think China's still very much viewed as a bully in many parts of Europe. Within COVID, during this time, this has not been the story of China's rise. We've seen Europeans react negatively to Chinese disinformation efforts. We've seen Europeans respond negatively to China's early missteps and cover-up of the virus. But again, if we continue to see the United States act irresponsibly on the world stage and have such a kind of fumbling response to this crisis at home, it does make that, I think, partnership with China look perhaps a bit more advantageous. So I think if we were to see a Trump administration, all these numbers show that this is kind of an accelerated declining transatlantic relationship that puts Europe in the position more to hedge when it comes to China, but also strengthen its own foundations as an independent geopolitical actor.
So an accelerator of the decline of the transatlantic relationship that will push the European Union more into being an independent or an autonomous foreign policy actor. Kinga Brzezinska, let me ask you the same question and see, are there, first, what's your analysis of what this would mean? And do you see room for positive cooperation, at least on certain sectoral issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Just maybe two remarks to what Tori just said. Yes, EU wants to call itself in the new political cycle, geopolitical commission, big ambitions, big plans, and all the changes. But I think EU is also aware that the pandemic will expose the limits of these ambitions. And the High Representative, Josep Borrell, has also mentioned it in the interviews after the COVID-19 has been in Europe present, and also he mentions that whatever happens, the US is an important and will remain an important ally of the EU. About the China, yes, I agree. I saw this poll as well. I wanted to quote those numbers because they are very appealing and very well done and very timely done. However, what I feel when I am in the EU, I also see the worrying signals about and disappointment with what China does. At the end of March, there was a survey done in Slovakia about what do they think, who helps them in tackling this crisis. We also had a shortage of medical supplies and masks. So there was a very, everyone acted in a shock. And of course, people said that they feel like China is helping Slovaks more than EU in terms of getting things and getting supplies in Poland, in Slovakia. I would not say it's a case now, because of the quality of the products that were delivered in China. I follow closely what is happening in Poland. There were 3 gigantic planes delivering supplies with Prime Minister welcoming, opening. Millions of Polish złotych were spent, while now the quality of these products are really low, and actually people question and track if they actually got to our hospitals in Poland, and if really they protected the citizens, and what about also the public money that was spent. So I would say this image of China, of course, the disinformation campaign, or this mask diplomacy, as sometimes it is called, it's been effective. But on the other hand, I think we shall see what we'll see in month or two, how perception of China also changes in Europe.
Nikolai, I'm going to ask you the same question about the Trump second term. I'd love also to have your reaction to these polls and what they mean about European public opinion.
I will disagree with what my previous panelists have said, and I will say that the following thing. President Trump is the democratically elected president of the United States, and if it will be him continuing in a second term, certainly there will be effects on public policy, but he is the democratically elected president, and he will be the one with whom we conduct business. Second of all, I noticed a worrying element in the, I would call it the crisis versus defense nexus, because we need so much money for crisis tackling, for recovery, etc. I've noticed that defense budgets are under threat, both in the EU and in the US, with cuts looming for certain programs. I'm thinking especially about the Europe Defense Initiative, and I'm thinking also about our own defense budget for the multi-annual framework of 7 years, which initially was set to be worth 13 billion, which is peanuts basically, but is now even less. At least in the draft that I've seen, it's around 7 billion or something like that. And I'm not happy with that, because, or at least if through the recovery, we also tackle things that are part of the general and larger national security understanding that I mentioned before, to compensate perhaps, but slashing defense budgets, I think, is the wrong move right now and not the right move, because the world is becoming a more complicated place, as we saw also with the actions during the crisis, as we see every day with the information war that's happening. I don't know what you guys are seeing in the US, but over here in Europe, we are flooded with news about Bill Gates' imminent arrest and some crazy conspiracies about how the West planned all of this crisis in order to weaken other global competitors. So I think I know I used the metaphor of a marriage, and then Tori, I believe, said that used a disintegrating relationship as a metaphor, and I saw one of the comments, I think it was Tanya, who said we should think more in terms of friends with benefits. I'm not completely sold on any of those terms. Let's not be friends with benefits. We are the transatlantic relation, that has lasted for 75 years now, and that includes the UK in my understanding and in my vision. So we are a strong bond. We are more than just friends with benefits. We are more than just a struggling relationship. We are allies. We are the world's most important allies. So I do not want to sell the relationship so easily, let's just say, to put it down the drain. And I do believe, because I saw there's a question about that, there's some easy wins we can have in this period, especially on medical research, especially on our joint effort, especially on coordinating perhaps these recovery packages, what it means for our economies, and also on trade. I think we can get some wins over there.
All right, thank you. But before turning to Mathare, I want to ask you, for the 3.5 European defense nerds that are watching us, you mentioned the EDF budget. So it's obviously the budget of the European Defense Fund, which was one of the innovations of the European Union put forth these last few years to fund common projects and investment in defense. It was initially, you mentioned it, already a fairly low budget between 13 and 15 billion euros. It was slashed in half before the COVID crisis in the budgetary negotiations. Can you tell us a little bit about where we stand and what's you think the timeline for also this budget to be voted? Nikolai, did you?
Oh, was that a question for me?
Yeah, as,
Right.
as a member of the
Yes,
European Parliament.
obviously for me, I sit in the Committee on Budgets and Foreign Affairs. I don't know why I didn't take it personally. Yes, obviously. No, I'm going to fight against this trend. I don't think it's the right way to go. I think it's irresponsible. We have been fighting for the EDF for a long time. I know that our American friends have seen this as maybe the European Union trying to gain strategic autonomy. Well, there's nothing wrong with having strategic autonomy. Is what statehood implies, no? I mean, every single state or every entity that has state functions should think about its strategic autonomy, first of all. So it is not something that goes against NATO. We cherish NATO. That's why I mentioned Defender Europe. I think that should be reorganized as soon as possible, because I'm worried about the capacity to deploy. I'm worried about crossing borders with military equipment. It might take, worst comes to worst, it might take a couple of weeks to get from one place to another. That's unacceptable in today's rapid warfare. So we as Europeans, we have done we have had some developments in that regard. We kept it to 5 days, the limit of time needed for authorizing crossing of borders of military materiel, but we still have problems in terms of infrastructure. I mean, some of the rail infrastructure is not compatible between member states because during the Soviet time there was a certain width of rails, and that still hasn't changed in some places. I mean, we still have stuff to work on, and I think that EDF budget is needed for that and other purposes.
Thank you. Mithri, I'm going to ask you the same question on what potential positive agenda there could be on the transatlantic front if President Trump is reelected. Nikolai just mentioned potential wins on trade, on health. What do you think that would mean for the European Union?
I think it's at this point that Europe needs to really ask itself, where do we want to position ourselves as we come out of the crisis? Because knee-jerk reactions during a crisis are not exactly the right way to think about things. And if you put yourself in the minds of a boardroom of a company that is operating in this environment, while there are knee-jerk reactions to protecting their employees or the cash flows or the short term, most companies at this point are putting themselves in the shoes of what do we do once we come out of this crisis? How do we deal with a new paradigm shift in the way the world functions? And how do we want to position ourselves in that? So if you don't have the cash flows, you put yourself in a weak position and you are up for sale. Is your government going to allow you to be bought over by the Chinese? Who will you partner with? Where will your technology go? And that really comes down to policy making, right? If you look at a Trump situation, I think it's very easy for us to keep talking about the today and react to Twitter accounts and whatever he says on Twitter. None of the people around him, I think, would want us to focus on that in this situation, especially his economic advisors. You want to look maybe like a company would 5 years down the line. What is the world going to look like 5 years down the line? How do you make a plan for that? And how do you take steps and have the right conversations? So you're already seeing companies kind of circumvent certain areas where they want to have conversations directly with MEPs like Nicola. They want to have conversations directly with Congress. Lobbies come into that. That's, of course, a given. They're pushing their own agenda and you're seeing some negative consequences of that. But the question is a conversation still happening? And right now, this Zoom helps enormously in having those conversations. Those conversations haven't stopped. Everyone is trying to plan for what happens in November if we see Trump come back. Many people I'm speaking to think it is going to be a return for another couple of years of a Trump-esque environment. But again, ask yourself that question, even if it's a Democratic president, Are things going to be that different? Is America going to be in a position to lead the world if you have 15% unemployment and you're trying to deal with a recession that is going to pretty much distract every politician into focusing in-house rather than looking outward and leading the world? And is this a moment where we start talking about things like track and trace apps, for example, right? Oh, yes, track and trace will get us to control the problem right now, and then we can get back to work and the economy can come bouncing back. But then where are those track and trace apps going to come from? What model are we going to adopt? All of that will really fit into a shell of where we go, rather than looking at what will Trump do if he comes back. I agree with Nicola. It doesn't matter who's in power in the Oval Office. They have to be dealt with. How you have a conversation with them and how you negotiate with them is the most important thing, whether you're a business standing individually as a collective or as an EU government. And that's pretty much what I'm hearing from CEOs across the board.
So that's a perfect segue to the next question, because we have a question: how would the EU protect its citizens and companies from Chinese IP theft and intelligence operations perpetuated through companies like Huawei, Xiaomi, or Zoom? But I want to broaden this question. I think it's very interesting, but more generally to the transatlantic conversation about technology, digital issues, privacy. We've seen the European Union push forth a vision of digital sovereignty these last few years and pushing its own rules like GDPR. It had an impact, including on American companies. We've seen a lot of pressure from the United States for the Europeans not to adopt Chinese technology and critical infrastructure like Huawei. Mehri talked about companies bringing back supply chains from China. So I want to ask all four of you about how COVID-19 is going to impact and potentially accelerate this transatlantic technology conversation. I'll start with Kinga.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, so this will be for sure. Many people say often that, crisis is also an opportunity. I don't like this saying, but perhaps in this sense, it might because of the economic decline and the recessions, two regions might find a way. Even though it will be difficult, we see that even EU is divided in this topic. We in the comments we also said that I also saw that there is a question about strategic autonomy and that there is no political will or consensus. I think it applies as well to the question that you asked, the technology and the differences between the US and the EU. EU, I think one of the most common also trends that has been mentioned that will have an impact is the future of the European integration. So I think in the long and short term, the EU will have to ask the question where exactly what the future will bring and what kind of union it wants. And I think I will leave it here for further discussions.
Tori, let me turn to you.
I think this question, Ben, gets back at your earlier pressing for a positive transatlantic relationship and agenda coming out of this crisis. One aspect of a positive agenda would be cooperating and advancing democratic standards in AI and emerging tech that meet the needs of free societies. And before this crisis and throughout it, we've seen China continue to advance a digital authoritarian model based on censorship and monitoring. We've continued to see the push from Huawei into Europe with some backlash from European countries like the UK. And I mean, I'm not a tech expert by any means, but I think at the strategic and the democratic level, there is a vast conversation to be had between the US, Europe, and democratic partners on enhancing standards that again, allow for digital privacy and push back against the censorship and monitoring tools that China is exporting around the world. It will be very interesting to see how some tracking apps come out of this crisis, and to what extent democracies are willing to tolerate it. But I absolutely see that the tech and AI space and pooled research and shared R&D as an area for a positive transatlantic conversation.
Yeah, and I agree with you that the question of the tracking apps also and the privacy risk linked to it, the potential hacking risks as well are going to be a major issue coming forward. Nicola.
Yes, that's a conversation that we have also a lot in Europe. Now, my point of view on the apps and all the technologies, I think the technology should be an ally. We should not move away from innovation. I agree. You know, we have a very high threshold for privacy, etc. in Europe. We don't have a European firewall. You know, this morning I came from a discussion on cybersecurity, and these days, you know, we're holding a conversation on Zoom. These days, not only your home is no longer your castle, but your country is no longer your castle. You know, it's everybody can snoop in from pretty much everywhere. And that's a major challenge we face. Now, on the tracking apps, I do believe, however, that the governments, sorry, let me rephrase it, societies need all the tools they can have and can muster in order to combat the crisis and combat COVID-19. So if we can do it via technology and via the express acceptance of people to participate in such tracking apps, so opt-in, the opt-in system, then I'm in favor, without, you know, being too much in favor of government developed solutions, but rather the market should take care of that. But we had a very intense conversation in the EU as well. And, you know, my point of view is that we need to use technologies as much as we can. If you've read Bill Gates's piece in The Economist, in which he says that this is not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning. So we are still, we're quoting Churchill, it wasn't him who said this first, but it just means that we are in the beginning phase, and this is still going to last. And until we do have a vaccine, we have to use all the available means.
And let me turn to Maitrey on also the same question: what impact this crisis can have on the transatlantic conversation on technology issues, which you alluded to already a little bit in your previous answer.
I think it's kind of like what everyone has said, including Tori and Nicola and Kinga. It's very clear. We were already working towards an automated world, right? And whoever dominates in the field of AI is going to lead economically. They're going to lead in terms of politics and political mind frames and where we go. The interesting bit that we're forgetting is that for all of the emerging markets, they're still in the phase of still catching up in the COVID graph itself. So if you're talking about Brazil or India or Russia, they're still playing catch up in terms of death numbers or even getting control of it. And what you're seeing very interestingly within those businesses is that you have to understand these are countries that were still putting their employees first and foremost, right? It was very heavily reliant on human workforce. They're being forced to automate things much, much sooner than they were supposed to. So I've spoken to companies in India and in Brazil who've said, we weren't planning to do this, but we've had to speed up the automation process. And they're doing the leapfrog. Just like Africa did with mobile phones, they're doing the leapfrog already. What we are in a very unique position to do, looking at how Chinese companies are investing in the Silicon Valley, is to ensure that we in Europe, whether it's the UK, I still consider that we are part of Europe, or whether it's the European continent itself, puts itself in a unique position of saying, we have some amazing startups that we don't fund enough, we don't back enough, and we have amazing founders who should be given the push and the thrust to innovate that tech so that we come up with tech that's relevant to a liberal democratic society, citizens who have the ability to do that instead of trying to take technology from X or Y societies that don't match up. We're not doing that yet. So we're currently in a position of being forced to look at Huawei as an option. Why are we not looking at Ericsson as an option? Because it's not an option, frankly. When we look at technology today in Europe, the whole process of being slow and steady, it used to work great in the old days. We don't have that luxury anymore. And for us to be able to speak to the United States or companies in the Silicon Valley or anywhere in the US, to be able to do it on an equal footing, we need to ramp it up as quickly as we ramped up our reaction, or maybe quicker than the lockdown reaction that we had, and say, okay, this is where we can benefit. Because if we fall behind in that AI war that we thought was a couple of years in the making, but the fact that we're all sitting around on Zoom right now says, why are we not sitting on an app that was created in Europe? That is your big $1 million question. If we don't fight that game right, and if we don't back the companies in Europe right, we can't have dialogues on an equal footing either with China or the US.
Yeah, thank you. And you're right that it is the $1 million question. And the question more often being asked, it seems right now in Europe, is more about the norms and standards and the regulation for these technologies, which is obviously critical, especially in the transatlantic space. But there is also the question of having the startups and having the innovation at the same time emerge from Europe, which when you look at the patents and everything, clearly Europe is lagging behind today.
But we don't lag behind when it comes to regulation. I think if you speak to open-minded business people, even in the United States, while they resent a lot of the regulation, they do always acknowledge that, hey, at least someone came up with rules of the game. GDPR, as much as people cry about it, they kind of go, at least it sets out parameters and we can work with those parameters. So we do have the ability in Europe to kind of set a trend. We just need to really take ownership of it.
Absolutely. Let me take the last two questions together so I can give you an opportunity to respond to either or. So one is, what opportunities and instruments are there for the European Parliament and Congress in terms of mitigating divergent transatlantic views and advancing towards a common post-corona agenda? And I also want to broaden a little bit this question and ask you more generally, we talk about governments, we talk, Brussels and President Trump, but what are the other actors that could play a role in this transatlantic relations? We've talked about private companies. Nikolai mentioned the fact that this was a crisis for 27 countries, but also 50 states. I want to ask you if, can governors, mayors, companies, civil society actors actually play a role in the transatlantic relationship, especially in a time of hurdles when it comes to governments. And the second question is the question of strategic autonomy. This is a concept that we've heard a lot from Europe. There needs to be both a common political will and capabilities, but clearly lacking today. How do we overcome this? And I want to ask also the question from the American perspective, should this strategic autonomy, European strategic autonomy, should it be feared? Should it be encouraged? What would it mean for the transatlantic relations? So these two questions, what are the new actors of the relationship and the question of strategic autonomy? Let me start with Kinga.
Thank you, Ben. It's a lot of questions to cover. Let me also refer, maybe I would just have one remark about the technology, app tracking and data protection. I think what the virus brought to us and me personally was also about, we have this discussion and we've talked about it. It's okay to use the apps, but who owns the data? Do we prefer our governments or the companies? This was a discussion that has been now going on. And I think here it depends on, on the trust on your governments, and it depends where do you live. Would you like, if you don't trust your government, would you pose yourself in the situation that you download the app and you share the picture, or maybe it's you understand all the questions, the burden put on the police to visit you twice a day, but on the other hand, if you don't trust where your data is, and your details and how it might use in the future, this is the big question. And I would say that here I'm in favor, and I'm happy about the discussion and Google protecting basically not giving out our data to the governments. I agree also the GDPR, and I think it was more broadly discussed as a Brussels effect, and how EU projects its power and basically does not, is seen more outside as a global player, but does not see itself. I think Joseph Boller also mentioned that EU has to learn the language of power. This is an example. On the other hand, we also saw, at least here in Slovakia, that, and this is also included in the GDPR, that in case of the pandemic or national security reasons, this can be suspended. And here also governments acted, I would say, really quickly in terms of tracking us where we are in Europe. Because of the Schengen, you could travel, and we were confused at the very beginning. Can we move to the countryside? Can we move to other countries under the lockdown? But then quickly somehow our data and phone tracking services were in governments could use them and put us into the quarantine. So I think this is discussion is only the start of discussions in this sense as well. When it comes to maybe I will turn to the positive sides. I think another $1 million question right now will be the vaccine, and who comes up with it first, and will be shared with allies, and to what extent. I think it's when I listen to Radek Sikorski, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, in his podcast, this is the first questions he asked all the Americans that he interviews. Is really the how the U.S. will react, and I think this will also define the future transatlantic relations.
Thank you. Let me turn to Tori.
Thanks, Ben. I'll pick up two of your questions very briefly. First, on the actors outside of government that we should be looking to. On the crises that we face today, and I'll just name three. One, the health pandemic crisis. Second, on the climate front. And then thirdly, a lot of the, I would add, democratic backsliding we're seeing around the world. Most of the actors that can make a change in these places are out of government. So on the health front, it's working with individuals in the medical and scientific community on research for a vaccine. On the climate front, a lot of change will be made at the state and local levels, and also within the private sector. And on the democratic backsliding front, a lot of the actors we're seeing with agency in countries that are experiencing backsliding are civil society organizations and foundations that are trying to keep this space open. And so I think there's a lot of room for actors on these three fronts outside of government. And then lastly, on this point we've kept coming back to on European strategic autonomy, I mean, first and foremost, this will be a question for Europe to answer. But I think from the US perspective, true transatlanticists should support this shift. At the strategic level, that means going from looking at Europe as a kind of pawn in this new great game of competition to a geostrategic actor in itself. Europe is tremendously strong on the world stage as an economic heavyweight, a regulatory heavyweight, as has been mentioned, and as a democratic and human rights heavyweight. And we should support that, which means at the defense level, dropping opposition to initiatives like EDF and PESCO, at the political level, dropping opposition to European integration, and on the economic front, supporting Europe's efforts to strengthen its competition laws, its trade enforcement mechanisms, its investment screening mechanisms, so that Europe can better stand on its own 2 feet, whether that be vis-a-vis the United States or China.
Thank you. Let me turn to Nikolai.
Can just echo what Tori just said. I agree to these points, and she made it in a very, very structured way. To your question, I would also add, don't forget parliamentarians, so legislators, because they do have a great role to play. And I'm thinking, for instance, of some very specific progress we made with the US Congress. I'm thinking of the Judicial Redress Act that helped citizens protect their data when they are on the US territory. That was the work of Jim Sensenbrenner and other people in Congress. And that was especially as a result of what we were doing transatlantically. The process is called Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. I know that sounds perhaps bureaucratic, but it's what we have. It's a group of MEPs from here, or I mean the MEPs from the delegation where I serve, where Radek Sikorski serves as chair. And on the other side, it's people like Jim Costa, Joe Wilson, and other people who are active on Gregory Meeks, who are active on the relationship. So we would like to see this brought forward. I think I might even suggest that we try to hold the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue online until the possibility is back to do it physically, but we exchange letters back and forth. We also exchange a lot with the National Governors Association, NGA. We work with different actors. We work with states, especially those that have European investments that they depend on. I mean, the Carolinas, I mean, I don't need to mention Texas is one of them, many other ones, California on climate change. So we do have a broad and multifaceted approach in our relationship. And I do believe that we as legislators need to be stronger out there and just not leave it to the leaders. No, I mean, I thought we said before that the crisis is also a crisis for autocrats and people to take advantage while they're at the very top. Well, let's bring it to the grassroots then. I mean, let's reaffirm our liberal values, our participation, our grassroots democracy. Why not?
Thank you. And let me turn to Methray for a last word.
I love last words. That's brilliant. I'm only going to say I can't disagree at all with what Kinga Tori and Nicola have said. They've really hit the nail on the head. This is about actors across the board. Stakeholders are every single human being that's been involved in this crisis, no matter where they live, under what kind of government they live. Involving them is absolutely critical, and you will see that that is the one thing that will change. We might all be stuck in our homes, but we are communicating a lot more than we ever did before. And it's really bringing forward one clear picture. Governments don't work in isolation. They cannot work in isolations. It cannot be people talking in silos. And we've always talked about business in one silo, government in a silo, people in a silo, academics in a silo. And you're suddenly seeing, you can look across the screen right now, everyone's talking to each other. They're trying to exchange ideas because this is such a new normal. So what you're going to end up getting is civil society, think tanks, foundations, governments, business, all trying to get one message through, which is to survive and to thrive. And you're going to have two people come out of this, the disruptors and the disrupted. And it is going to be the disruptors who can survive and thrive. And hopefully that's going to be a message that resonates all the way up to leaders who might not want to listen, whether they're autocrats or part of a democratic government who are just not listening. So hopefully this works. COVID might have an upside.
Well, I'm very glad that we're finishing on this optimistic note. And I completely agree with you. We can't respond to this. We can't work in isolation. And I think this really strikes at the heart of what both GlobeSec and the Atlantic Council are trying to do. Make the case for global cooperation, for a transatlantic response to this crisis, but also not just be analysts or thinkers of it, but really shape it and be agents. And so this is why I'm very grateful that you took the time for this conversation. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who joined. We'll see you soon for another of these conversations, and hopefully very soon in a physical room where we can also maybe have a drink after the conversation. In the meantime, please stay well, stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.